Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is Bronte Sisters Black Tea Blend from Simpson and Vale. It's a flavored black tea. It has the strongest flavor is after the black tea is papaya. Yeah, and some other flowers and bits. Uh, it's a bit of a weird choice for the Bronte sisters, but I haven't really figured it out, but it is good. But when I finish it, I'm not sure if I'm gonna get it again only because I'm a little bit nothing against the actual tea. It's a good tea, but I'm a little off flavored black teas right now. I mean, I still like Earl Grey and maybe like London Fog, which is kind of an Earl Grey, and that sort of thing. Rose tea. I'm not totally over it, but I'm just a little less into it than I used to be. So we'll see. Maybe I'll just simplify things a little bit. Every day changes, like my moods. Excuse me. And anyway, Freddie is part of the action today. A little bit. Anyway, so this is sort of an update, a wrap up of the last part of February. I read about 4 books in the first half-ish of February, and then I read 3 more books afterwards. So it's about those 3 books. And of course, that's why I'm mentioning the Brontes in my tea choice, because I do like the tea, but mainly because I read a Bronte book, and I always feel good when I do that for some reason. I think because they are not, they're not hard to read, but they do, I don't know. I find reading a Bronte just to be weirdly enough an accomplishment, but an enjoyable one usually. And this, of course, in my case, was no exception. This is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, who I tend to say is my favorite, which makes me feel a little bit like a hipster because the obscure one is the one I like, and she's not super obscure around people who really know the Brontes or who are familiar with English literature, especially Victorian literature. But I do feel like still the other 2 sisters, especially Charlotte, but even Emily with Wuthering Heights gets the big amount of attention. So I'm only too happy to always bring attention to Anne Bronte's books. This is the first one of Anne's that I read close to 20 years ago. It was somewhere, because I know what I was doing for work, so somewhere between the years of 2002 and 2004. I'm leaning towards 2003. So close to 20 years ago. Excuse me. And a lot of my rereads have been like around that time period that I've been rereading books from. And I feel good about it. I feel like I've been enjoying my rereads almost more than the newer books that I've been reading. And that's okay because, like I said, moods change a little bit. So when I first read it, I remember the thoughts I had on it, which was basically that I never want to become a governess. And now Freddie has taken a nap on Agnes Grey, so you may not see it again. I may not want, I don't want to be a governess, and like ever, if I can help it. Not that I'm qualified to. I don't think I'm qualified to work with anyone's children in any capacity at all. People's cats, maybe, unless they need a specific kind of medicine. Even then, but not so much. Anyway, but Anne Bronte, the writer, obviously, was writing not an entirely autobiographical novel because a lot of things that happened in the long run in the story didn't happen to her, or maybe something along the lines of wishful thinking. I don't know, but yeah. So I remember thinking that the first time I read it, and I remember thinking that there's something about Anne's writing that isn't, I don't know, it's so hard to compare writers and their styles or whatever, but I feel like she gives, I don't want to give away spoilers, but I feel like she likes to fix things like Jane Austen did in a way. But I don't like to compare the Austens and the Brontes because they were different people, they had some similarities, the father who was, in the church, and I don't know what else. They didn't. Well, they both had brothers, but well, the Brontes only had one brother, but still, there were some similarities, but they were really different generation, different locations, really. But I do think that Anne had something in common, but just not like it. I would say maybe compared to her sisters, uh, but I don't remember if Anne had opinions on Jane Austen. I probably could look it up and find out, but I know Charlotte had usually not as positive thoughts about Jane Austen's novels. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm digressing, but the story is of a family who is also the father is, I think, a curate. I can't remember the exact positions they all hold. Sometimes it's vicar, or sometimes it's, you know, whatever. And so, like, seriously, how many times I've read uh, uh, English novels of the past couple of centuries, and I still can't get it straight. I don't think I ever will. Maybe I'll make a project of it one day, but not yet. Anyway, but so Agnes Grey has a sister and her mother and father. Her mother gave up basically her kind of well-off life to marry the father, because her own father was just not approving of the relationship. So it's, mildly romantic, but of course you always see what occurs, and they run into a bit of financial difficulty, as the daughters are growing up, and Agnes decides that she wants to help out by becoming a governess. And as we know, well, not everybody knows this, but I guess if you've read anything about the Brontes, Charlotte and Anne were governesses at different points in their life. But Anne, excuse me, that was, I think, I could be wrong. I think that was her only occupation. I think she had some interesting experiences, and I think the novels were somewhat based on it. Like I said before, um, her second placement, where the people that she lived with were somewhat successful for a while, but at the same time, her brother Branwell worked with them, and he seems to have had a relationship with the mother, and that must have messed things up for Anne. This is not really covered in Agnes Grey, just FYI, in case you're looking for details on that situation and what Anne would have thought of it. I'm sure she wasn't happy about that situation, but this, in this case, the first family she goes to are younger children, but they're somewhat spoiled, and the son especially is very cruel to animals. There's a lot of commentary on the treatment of animals, and anyone who is kind to animals, you could tell, are the good people, and anyone who is cruel or in any way. Even there was one person who should be a good person, but they kick cats and stuff like that, and you could tell this isn't someone you're rooting for at all. Um, so there's the frustration of really not being able to make much of a difference for the children that are under her care. She could do her job, but if the parents are not willing to back her up, there's not so much she could do. So the first situation is the first situation. The second one she ends up with is a bit longer, and of course it brings her into company with certain people, and it's a little more interesting because the daughters are a bit older and getting into marriageable age. So there's a whole bunch of slight shenanigans that result. I enjoyed it. There are some dramatic things that happen, especially in the early part of the book, but I think it's a nice, quiet novel. Agnes Grey is one of those more, I hate to use the word demure, but keeps her feelings to herself, doesn't like to reveal what's going on, at least not to the people that she works for. So I don't know if it's definitely not the best of the Bronte novels, but I remember reading it back when I read it the first time and thinking I really should read Tenant of Wildfell Hall, because I really think that I enjoy reading Anne's prose, and her style is something that I like. And turned out that I loved Tenant of Wildfell Hall again. So I was hoping that I would like Agnes Grey the second time, and I did. I liked it very much. I enjoyed it. There are things I could pick apart. I don't want to give away spoilers, but there are things in which that I say, okay, this was maybe a little bit too much, or they spent too much time on this and too little time on that. But generally, I thought it was a pretty even read, and honestly wasn't, as I know I was saying that sometimes the Brontes, you feel like it's an accomplishment, but it wasn't intimidating in terms of like when you read Charlotte with very many big words and lots of French. Anne is a little more chill with that sort of thing. So I liked this very much. I think it was probably one of my favorite reads of the month. Moving on to my library books. So the two books that I finished at the end of February were both books that I took out of my local library. I have library cards in two different library systems. One is the New York Public Library, which is a number of boroughs in New York City, and then I have the Queensborough, which is my borough, and there is a library very quick walking distance from where I live, and it only reopened later last year, I think, because it was closed for the pandemic, and there was another one that was open. I had to take quite a hike to get to, so I've been kind of spoiled, if I am looking for a book and I don't want to buy it and I want to put it on hold at the library, if I don't find it at the New York Public Library, which surprisingly happens more often than you'd think, I would put it on hold at the Queen's Library, which is great. It has been working out for me a lot lately, except I just got word that the closest library to me is closing for over a year, like I think close to a year and a half, for renovations, which I don't understand why, but I hope that it turns out really nice because it's incredibly inconvenient. And for me, it's inconvenient in terms of just having the backup library that I can walk to very quickly. Um, but I could probably live without it for some time. But I feel like people in the neighborhood who use that as a resource, who have just started being relieved to have it back, won't have it anymore. The closest library is still a pretty long walk away. On a beautiful day, I could do it happily. But when the weather's a little bad, and if you have a lot of books to take back, it could be annoying. So I decided I got to finish whatever books I can finish from there, because in a couple of days it'll be closed for quite some time, and so I thought I'd make that the priority. I hate having to make something a priority without, maybe being in the mood for it, but it ended up okay in the long run. So the first one I finished was the reading list, which I've had out for a while, and I wanted to read it. It's by Sarah Nisha Adams. It came out last year, I think. I wanted to read it because it's a book about books, which I love. It's a novel about books, and it takes place in London, which is something else that I quite love. Only reason why I didn't quite want to read it in February, even though it works because a lot of it takes place in a library, and Library Love Readathon, I mean, really, but is because on the surface it sounds a lot like the book that I read just a couple weeks ago, All the Lonely People, which was about a widowed man kind of coming out of his shell and getting involved with people in the community again, living in London. This is about Mukesh, who is a widowed elderly man who, well, in this case, he has a bunch of daughters who are kind of fussing over him a little bit, and he lives in London, and yeah, he starts to come out a little bit more, maybe spending a little more time with other people as the book progresses. But the main deal is that his wife, who he loved very much, died of cancer just a couple of years ago, and she was a big reader. So he apparently still had a library book of hers out, which he decided to read. I think it is in an attempt to feel close to her again. So he reads it and then brings it back to the local library and meets somebody there named Alicia, who was working there. She's a teenager, but like late teens. And her circumstance is that she is living at home with her mother and her brother's kind of given up a lot to take care of the family. The father left them for, another woman earlier and has his own family. So the mother is dealing with some severe, I don't think they identified exactly what it was, but some severe anxiety issues. She can be hard to approach sometimes. She retreats into herself a lot, and she hardly ever leaves the house. So Alicia's dealing with a lot. But she takes this job at the library, even though she's not that into reading books. She comes across Mukesh and eventually helps him out, but she helps him using a list that she finds, a reading list that gives a bunch of book suggestions, and she just starts recommending each book to him. And so that is kind of the book. it gets into each book individually and sort of what they'll talk about the book itself and then certain things in life. There's like life lessons or whatever from each book. I liked it. I liked reading more, I think, about Mukesh because I just loved how he really formed a love for books, and I loved his relationship with his granddaughter Priya, who was really into books. And there's a great part, I don't want to give away everything, but there's a great part where he takes her to a bookshop in in London, and ended up, as I was reading it, they didn't mention the name at first, and I was like, this is Foyles, this is definitely Foyles, and then it was Foyles, and it was very exciting to, because I really miss London, and I love bookshops anyway, and I love libraries, so it was really, that in itself was fantastic. I thought it was a good, enjoyable, bookish read. The story was good. Sometimes it would veer off because the list, apparently there was more than one copy of this reading list, and a number of other people got it over the couple of years, and so there's a little bit of a detour about each person and what happens to them when they find this list. But the only thing I would say, even though the ending, is good, a good conclusion, but I feel like it didn't tie up everything. That I feel like I'm wondering what is going to happen to certain people, and I don't think it really leaves room for a sequel, so I'm like, I just have to leave it to my imagination. But I did think it was enjoyable. I will give a warning. There is trigger warning or whatever, is that there was a suicide in the story. So if that's something you are not wanting to deal with, um, maybe give it a pass. But I did think it was an excellent book, especially a book about books. But I also think it would be good, if you are someone who wants to read more books, but you could use some suggestions. This might be a good one. I thought they were a little bit off. The author was a little bit off about Pride and Prejudice, which was one of the books. It was the way it was described. It was a little more about like somebody who hadn't read Pride and Prejudice in a long time and just is talking about, like I do that sometimes. I haven't read a book in a while and I just kind of go off on what it's about, and I'm probably a little bit wrong. That's how I felt about it, but otherwise it was pretty on point. So yeah, I did like this book a lot. And then I also read, I wanted to read this in March, for middle grade March, but because I have to bring it back to the library, I did not. So this is, well, it was a pretty quick read though. It was From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by E.L. Koningsberg. Very well known book. And it's yet one of the many, many, many books, middle grade or children's books that I somehow never read. Often my sister read them, or I'd heard about them somehow, but I just didn't read it. And so I've been catching up over the past few years with that. I read Secret Garden not too long ago. I'm currently reading Matilda. So, I feel like I'm making up for lost time a little bit, but I am glad that I got to this because I was curious about it. Famously, it's about two siblings that run away from home and spend some time living in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. I love that museum so much. I know it's changed a little bit from when this was written, which I think was the late 60s, 1960s. But yes, there have been some changes, but generally it's the same idea. Obviously, it's in the same location. It's been extended and some things have been moved around, of course. But anyway, so that in itself made it an enjoyable book. Just the descriptions of the museum and the areas they would spend in New York, in Manhattan, when they weren't in the museum. At one point, they decided to do some research on a work of art, and they go to a library, which happens to be the library local to where I work, my office. So that was really fun. And just different locations that are no longer in the city that either I'd heard of or I knew growing up. So a little bit nostalgic. So in that sense, it was a good book. My only issue was, I think it was the time that I was reading it, it was right around the second anniversary of when my cat ran away. Obviously, she came back. And I know it's not the same as losing a child or, a child going missing, but the feeling of not knowing where she was for a month was a horrible feeling, and I'm so glad she's back, even though she acts like she's not grateful. But I'm so glad she's back. But I think about this book, like they're gone for a while, and not super long while, but long enough. The parents are not described as horrible people, just maybe, a couple of things they could work on. And I thought the stress that they must have gone through, the horrible feelings that they must have felt when their two children, even though they had four children, but still, the two children are missing. Maybe, I know I'm not a parent, but just as an adult, I don't know, took me away from quite enjoying it as much as I think I could have enjoyed it. So that was one problem. Still a good story, obviously unrealistic, but do you really need everything to be exactly realistic? Makes me really want to go back to the museum. I haven't been back since last spring, and well, I'll make it happen at some point, I hope. And then the other issue for me was, I don't know, like I said, without giving away the ending, I wasn't crazy about how it ended. It wasn't terrible, but it just kind of fell flat for me. I just thought it was like, okay, but I feel like something's wrong with me because this is such a very popular book. It's got all these, what is it, Newbery medals and stuff, and like it's legendary. Everybody loves this book. But I didn't hate it for sure. I didn't mind it. I'd like to talk about it, but I gave it, well, Goodreads does not let you give half stars, but in my head I give it 3.5 stars because 4 stars is a book that I liked a lot. 5 stars is like almost could do no wrong. And 3 stars is usually like, there's something, I didn't hate it, but it was flawed, in my opinion. So 3.5 I think works for me. It was flawed, but I enjoyed it. Or at least I found it flawed. It's so hard to criticize something when you know it's your opinion rather than maybe the actual quality. It was a good book. There were references that I was surprised about. Like there was a part where the boy found a unopened candy bar, and his sister Claudia was like, don't eat that because there's probably marijuana in it. That's how they get you hooked. And I was like, I didn't know that in the 60s. I mean, I know the 60s, there was a lot about drugs happening, obviously, but I didn't know that the kids knew this stuff. I really have to learn about what it was like to grow up as a kid in the 60s, because I don't really know that much. My parents were both teenagers, I think, mostly in the 60s. So anyway, and I can't ask them now anyway. But it was a good half of the month. Let me know how your February went. If it was a good reading month, if you accomplished what you wanted to. Was it relatively good, the reading, or not so good? Let me know what you thought of these books too, if you've read them or if you want to read them. And that is all for now. This is Catherine at Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day.